He walked into a luxury dealership as a forgotten Vietnam veteran. He walked out owning every single car. The old man's boots clicked against the spotless showroom floor. His flannel shirt looked out of place among the glass, chrome, and million-dollar machines. To the salesman, he was just another relic. "Are you lost, sir?" One sneered. Another laughed, pointing to the purple heart pinned discreetly to his chest. "You gonna pay with medals?" But Walter Brewster was no ordinary customer. He was a Vietnam veteran, a man who had faced down death in the jungles of Southeast Asia. For a moment, time froze. His eyes, pale, steady, haunted, locked on theirs. He had once stared down death in a jungle thousands of miles away. Now, in this palace of luxury, he was being measured by the clothes on his back. What happened next would leave everyone in the dealership speechless and change countless lives far beyond those gleaming walls. This is the story of how a soldier's grief became a legacy of hope and how humiliation turned into redemption. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A hero's honor is not always seen, but it is always felt. The old man stood before the gleaming dealership, a ghost from a forgotten time. What brought a man who had faced down death to a place that sold glossy, overpriced dreams? Title: You're gonna pay with medals? Veteran humiliated at car dealership until he bought the whole fleet. The polished glass doors of Prestige Motors slid open with a quiet whoosh, releasing a blast of cold air. It smelled of new leather and ambition, a world away from the dusty scent of the old pickup truck Walter Brewster had just parked at the edge of the lot. The truck, a faded blue Ford, had served him faithfully for 20 years. It was a humble beast, its dents and scratches telling the story of a life lived, not displayed. Inside, the dealership was a cathedral of modern excess. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the metallic curves of a dozen luxury cars. Each vehicle sat on its own pedestal, spotlit like a museum piece. The floor, a vast expanse of white tile, was so clean it mirrored the bright lights above. It was a place designed to make a man feel small, to make him feel he needed what they were selling to be whole. Walter was 72 years old. His face was a roadmap of his life, etched with the fine lines of laughter and the deeper furrows of loss. His hands, though slightly gnarled with age, were steady. They were hands that had held a rifle, comforted a dying friend, and cradled his newborn daughter. He wore a simple flannel shirt, clean but worn at the cuffs, and a pair of sturdy work boots. His posture was straight, a remnant of a lifetime of discipline, and his eyes, a clear, pale blue, held a quiet intensity that could be unsettling. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the world, both its beauty and its brutality. 3 salesmen in sharp, tailored suits were clustered near a fiery red sports car, laughing amongst themselves. They were young, their faces smooth and confident. When they saw Walter, their laughter died in their throats. They exchanged quick, dismissive glances. Their eyes scanned his simple attire, his weathered face, his old-fashioned haircut. In their world of shiny surfaces and quick commissions, Walter was an anomaly, a relic from a bygone era. One of the salesmen, a man named Chad with a gelled-up hairdo and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, detached himself from the group and sauntered over. His walk was a study in practiced arrogance. "Good morning, sir," Chad said, his voice smooth as silk but laced with a condescending tone. "Can I help you with something? Are you lost?" Walter met his gaze evenly. "I'm not lost. I'm here to buy a car." Chad's smirk widened. He looked Walter up and down again, a little more slowly this time, as if searching for some hidden sign of wealth he might have missed. He found none. "A car," Chad repeated, the word dripping with amusement. "Of course. Any particular model you had in mind? Or are you just browsing?" "I need something reliable," Walter said, his voice calm and steady. "Something safe." "Safe?" Chad echoed, a chuckle bubbling under his words. "Well, all of our cars are safe. The safest money can buy." He gestured vaguely at the showroom floor. "But they are also quite expensive." "I'm aware of that," Walter said. A younger salesman, Kevin, who had been watching from a distance, now approached, sensing an opportunity for some morning entertainment. "Chad, Maybe the gentleman would be more comfortable at the used car dealership down the street, Kevin suggested, his voice loud enough for Walter to hear clearly. They have some great deals on vintage models. The two salesmen shared a snicker. Walter's expression didn't change. He had faced down enemy fire in the dense jungles of Vietnam. The taunts of two overconfident boys in expensive suits were like pebbles bouncing off a tank. I'm not interested in a used car, Walter stated plainly. I want to buy a new one. In fact, I'm interested in that one. He pointed to a sleek, black sedan. It was the dealership's flagship model, a car that cost more than most people's homes. Chad and Kevin stared at the car and then back at Walter, their amusement turning to open disbelief. That one, Chad scoffed. Sir, that's the Orem V12. It's $250,000. I know, Walter said. The absurdity of the situation was too much for Chad. He burst out laughing, a harsh, braying sound that echoed through the cavernous showroom. Kevin joined in, a high-pitched giggle that made him sound like a hyena. $250,000, Chad wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. And how are you planning on paying for that, old-timer? You gonna pay with metals? He pointed a mocking finger at Walter's chest, where a small, discreet pin of the Purple Heart was affixed to his flannel shirt, almost hidden in the plaid pattern. The moment the words left Chad's mouth, the air in the dealership seemed to freeze. The laughter died. The smiles vanished. The casual cruelty of the remark hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Walter's calm demeanor finally cracked. A flicker of something cold and hard sparked in his pale blue eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet intensity of his gaze was enough. My metals, Walter said, his voice low and dangerous, are not for sale. They were paid for with a price you couldn't possibly comprehend. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he produced a black credit card, the kind with no spending limit, the kind that was offered only to a select few. He placed it on the hood of the black sedan with a soft, deliberate click. I'm not here to buy just that car, Walter said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority that made both salesmen take an involuntary step back. I'm here to buy them all. Every last car in this showroom. And I'm going to pay for them in cash. The silence that followed was absolute. Chad and Kevin stood frozen, their mouths agape, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They had made a terrible mistake. They had judged a book by its cover, and they were about to find out that this particular book was a leather-bound, first edition classic, filled with stories of honor, sacrifice, and a quiet, unshakable strength they couldn't even begin to imagine. The dealership's general manager, a portly man in his 50s named Bob, came rushing out of his office, his face flushed. He had heard the commotion and had seen the black card sitting on the hood of the Orem V12. He knew what that card meant. It meant that the old man his salesman had been mocking was not just a customer. He was a titan. Sir, Bob stammered, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror as he scurried towards Walter. I am so sorry. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Walter didn't even look at him. His eyes were still locked on Chad and Kevin, who now looked like two scared children who had been caught playing with matches. There's no misunderstanding, Walter said, his voice as cold as a winter morning. These two young men were just explaining to me how I was going to pay for my purchase. Bob's face turned a shade of purple that clashed with his expensive tie. He whirled on Chad and Kevin, his voice a furious whisper. What did you say to him? Chad was speechless. Kevin looked like he was about to faint. He asked if the gentleman was going to pay with metals. Kevin stammered, his voice trembling. If it were possible, Bob's face turned an even darker shade of purple. He looked like he was about to have a stroke. He turned back to Walter, his hands clasped together in a gesture of supplication. Sir, on behalf of Prestige Motors, I offer you my most sincere and humble apologies. The behavior of my employees was inexcusable, and I assure you they will be dealt with severely. Walter finally tore his gaze away from the two disgraced salesmen and looked at Bob. I'm not interested in your apologies, he said. I'm interested in buying these cars. All of them. Now, Bob swallowed hard. He had never sold a single car for $250,000, let alone the entire inventory of his showroom, which was worth well over $2 million. This was the biggest sale of his life, and it was happening under the most humiliating circumstances imaginable. Of course, sir, Bob said, his voice now dripping with a desperate eagerness to please. Whatever you want. We'll get the paperwork started right away. As Bob scurried off to his office, barking orders at his stunned staff, Walter walked slowly around the showroom, his work boots echoing on the pristine tile floor. He ran a hand over the cool, smooth finish of a silver convertible, his expression unreadable. He wasn't just buying cars. He was making a statement. A statement about respect. A statement about honor. A statement about the invisible wounds that so many of his generation carried with them. Wounds that were often dismissed or ignored by a world that was too busy, too loud, too obsessed with the shiny and the new. He stopped in front of a family-sized SUV, its dark blue paint reminding him of his old pickup truck. He saw his reflection in the polished surface, and for a fleeting moment, he didn't see an old man in a flannel shirt. He saw a young soldier, his face grim, his eyes haunted, a lifetime of war and loss stretching out before him. He thought of his daughter, Emily. She had been 7 years old when she was taken from him by a sickness that no amount of courage or strength could fight. She had been his light, his reason for living, the one thing that had kept the darkness at bay. When she died, a part of him had died with her. Emily had loved cars. She would sit on his lap in the old blue pickup, her small hands on the steering wheel, pretending to drive. "One day, Daddy," she would say, her voice full of childish dreams, "I'm going to have a car as big as our house, and I'm going to drive all the sick children to a magical hospital where they can get better." A single tear traced a path down Walter's weathered cheek. He wiped it away quickly, before anyone could see. This wasn't for him. This was for her. This was for all the children who deserved a chance to live out their dreams. He was going to build that magical hospital. And these cars, these symbols of wealth and power, they were going to be the foundation. The controlled chaos that erupted in the showroom was a sight to behold. Bob, the general manager, was a blur of motion, his face a constant sheen of sweat. He barked into his phone, his voice a mixture of panic and exhilaration. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. The entire floor. No, I'm not joking. A single buyer. Yes, sir, a gentleman named Walter Brewster." He covered the mouthpiece and hissed at a young woman in a sharp business suit. "Get me everything we have on a Walter Brewster. Now. And get him a coffee. The best coffee. Do we have any of that cat poop coffee? Get him that." Walter, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the storm he had created. He had found a small, leather armchair in a quiet corner of the waiting area and sat down. He looked like a grandfather waiting patiently for his daughter to finish her shopping, not a man who had just brought a multi-million-dollar business to a standstill. He accepted the steaming cup of expensive coffee from the trembling hand of the young woman and gave her a polite, almost gentle, nod. "Thank you, dear," he said, his voice soft again, the icy edge from before completely gone. The woman, who had been expecting a monster, could only stammer a "You're welcome, sir," before scurrying away. Chad and Kevin had been relegated to a corner, like naughty schoolboys. They stood stiffly, their faces pale, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially Walter. Their careers, they knew, were over. They had committed the cardinal sin of sales. They had insulted the customer. But this was so much worse. They hadn't just insulted a customer. They had insulted a legend, though they didn't know it yet. The report on Walter Brewster came back within minutes. Bob read it on his tablet, his eyes growing wider with each line. Walter Brewster was not just a veteran. He was a recipient of the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award for valor. He had single-handedly saved his entire platoon from an ambush in the Ashau Valley, an act of such bravery it had become the stuff of military legend. But the story didn't end there. After the war, Walter had quietly and methodically built a business empire from the ground up. He had started with a small trucking company, just him and his old blue Ford. Now Brewster Holdings was a global logistics giant, a silent, powerful force in the world economy. He was a billionaire several times over, yet he lived a simple, unassuming life in a modest house in the suburbs. He shunned the spotlight, his name rarely appearing in the news. He was a ghost, a myth, a man of immense power who chose to live as a simple man. Bob felt a fresh wave of nausea. He approached Walter's armchair, the tablet held in his hands like a sacred text. "Mr. Brewster, sir," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I had no idea. The Medal of Honor, your company. We are unworthy." Walter looked up from his coffee. His pale blue eyes were calm, but they held a deep, profound sadness. It's just a name, Bob. Just a name and a few stories. It doesn't make me better than anyone else. He took a slow sip of his coffee. But it does mean I've earned the right not to be judged by the clothes I wear. The words hung in the air, a quiet condemnation far more powerful than any shout. Bob could only nod, his head bowed in shame. The owner of the dealership, a man named Marcus Sterling, arrived an hour later. He was a man who exuded power, dressed in a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than Kevin's car. He swept into the showroom, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. The shell-shocked staff, the two disgraced salesmen huddled in the corner, and the quiet old man in the armchair who was the cause of it all. Sterling was a man who understood money, and he knew the kind of money Walter Brewster represented. But when Bob showed him the report on Walter's military record, Sterling's demeanor changed. He was from a generation that still remembered the sacrifices made in places like Vietnam. He walked over to Walter, not with the deference of a businessman to a client, but with the quiet respect of one man to another who had seen things he could only imagine. "Mr. Brewster," Sterling said, extending his hand. His voice was deep and resonant. "Marcus Sterling, it is an honor to have you in my dealership." Walter shook his hand. His grip was firm. "Mr. Sterling, I've been made aware of the incident this morning," Sterling said, his eyes flicking for a moment towards Chad and Kevin. "And I want to personally apologize. There is no excuse for the disrespect you were shown." "The disrespect was not just to me," Walter said calmly. "It was to every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform of this country." Sterling nodded slowly. "You are absolutely right." He turned to Bob. "Bob, you will refund Mr. Brewster's purchase in full. The cars are his. A gift from Prestige Motors. A small token of our immense respect and gratitude for his service." A collective gasp went through the showroom. $2 million in inventory given away. It was an unheard of gesture. But Walter shook his head. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Sterling, but I don't want a gift. I came here to buy these cars, and I will pay for them. But I do have a condition." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "Anything, Mr. Brewster. Name it." "I want these two," Walter said, pointing a steady finger at Chad and Kevin, "to deliver every single car. Personally." Chad and Kevin looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and dread. "Deliver them where?" Chad asked, his voice cracking. Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Sterling. On it was an address. It was the address of the Children's National Hospital. "You're donating them?" Sterling asked, his voice filled with a newfound admiration. "I'm not donating them," Walter corrected him gently. "I'm putting them to work. The hospital is starting a new program. A fleet of vehicles to transport sick children and their families to and from treatment, free of charge. They need reliable cars. Safe cars." He looked at the fleet of luxury vehicles around him. "These will do just fine." He then looked back at Chad and Kevin, his gaze piercing. "You two will not only deliver the cars, but you will also volunteer at the hospital for 1 month. You will work with the children. You will see what real courage looks like. You will see children fighting battles you can't even imagine, and you will see them do it with a smile. You will learn what it means to serve someone other than yourself." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And maybe," he finished, his voice softening slightly, "you will learn that a man's worth is not measured by the price of his suit, but by the size of his heart." The silence in the showroom was now one of awe. Marcus Sterling looked at Walter, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He had seen power, he had seen wealth, but he had never seen it wielded with such quiet, devastating grace. He had just witnessed a masterclass in humility and honor. "It will be done," Sterling said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to the two young salesmen, his expression now hard as stone. "You heard the man. You start tomorrow. And if I hear one word of complaint, if you show 1 ounce of disrespect to those children or their families, you will never work in this city again. Do you understand?" Chad and Kevin could only nod, their arrogance completely stripped away, leaving behind 2 very small, very scared young men who were about to get a lesson in life they would never forget. As the paperwork was finalized, Walter walked over to the large picture window that overlooked the lot. He saw his old blue pickup truck parked at the edge, looking small and insignificant next to all the new, shiny cars. But to him, that truck was worth more than all of them combined. It was the truck he had used to start his business. It was the truck he had brought his wife home from the hospital in. It was the truck he had driven his daughter Emily to her first day of school in. He remembered her little hand in his, her face bright with excitement. "Are you scared, Daddy?" she had asked him. He had smiled. "A little," he had admitted. She had squeezed his hand. "Don't worry," she had said, her voice full of a 7-year-old's wisdom. "I'll be brave for both of us." She had always been the brave one. Even at the end, in the sterile white room of the hospital, surrounded by machines that beeped and whirred, she had been brave. She had never cried, never complained. She had just held his hand and told him stories about the adventures they would have when she got better. But she never got better, and a part of Walter's world had ended with her. He had spent the years since trying to fill the void she had left behind. He had built his company, amassed a fortune, but none of it could bring her back. None of it could heal the wound in his soul. But now, standing in this temple of excess, surrounded by symbols of a life he had never cared for, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. A flicker of purpose. He couldn't bring Emily back, but he could honor her memory. He could keep her spirit alive. He could be brave, just like she had been. He was going to build a hospital in her name. A place of hope and healing, where no child would be turned away, where no family would have to worry about the cost of treatment. The cars were just the beginning. They were a symbol, a promise, a declaration of war against the sickness that had taken his daughter from him. He was Walter Brewster. He had faced down death in the jungles of Vietnam. He had built an empire from nothing. And now, he was going to take on his greatest challenge yet. He was going to fight for the lives of children, and he was going to do it with all the strength, all the resources, and all the love in his heart. He was going to build a legacy for Emily. A legacy of hope. A legacy of love. A legacy that would shine brighter than all the chrome and steel in this showroom. A legacy that would last forever. The next morning, a gleaming black Orem V12, the flagship of Prestige Motors, pulled up to the curb in front of a modest, 2-story house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb. Chad was behind the wheel, his face a mask of sullen resentment. He was wearing a polo shirt and khakis, a far cry from his usual tailored suit. Kevin sat in the passenger seat, nervously fiddling with the settings on the dashboard. They had spent the night in a state of shock, replaying the events of the previous day over and over in their minds. Their dismissal had been swift and brutal. Marcus Sterling had made it clear that their only path to any semblance of a future was to follow Walter Brewster's instructions to the letter. Walter was waiting for them on the porch, holding a steaming mug of coffee. He was wearing the same simple clothes as the day before. His old blue pickup truck was parked in the driveway, looking like a loyal old dog next to the sleek, powerful sedan. "Good morning, boys," Walter said, his voice neutral. "The coffee's fresh if you want some." Chad muttered something under his breath. Kevin, however, managed a weak, "No, thank you, sir." Walter nodded. "Fair enough. The rest of the cars will be delivered to the hospital throughout the day. I trust you two can handle the logistics." He handed Chad a set of keys. "This one is for you. It's registered in your name. All expenses paid for 1 year." Chad stared at the keys as if they were a venomous snake. "What's the catch?" he sneered. "No catch," Walter said simply. "It's a car. You sell them. Now you have one. But you'll be using it to drive the children. To their appointments, to their treatments, to the park on sunny days when they're feeling well enough. You'll be their chauffeur, their errand boy, and, if you're lucky, their friend." He then handed another set of keys to Kevin. "This one's yours," he said, gesturing to a silver convertible parked across the street. "Same deal." The two young men were stunned into silence. They had been expecting punishment, not a reward. They didn't understand. "Why?" Kevin finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because a man needs a tool to do his job," Walter said. "And your job, for the next month, is to serve, to give back, to learn that the world is bigger than your commission check." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. "My daughter, she loved cars. She used to say that a car wasn't just a machine. It was a chariot that could take you on adventures, that could make you feel free, even when you were sick, even when you were scared." He looked at them, and for the first time, they saw not an old man, not a billionaire, not a war hero, but a father who was still grieving. "Don't disappoint me," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Don't disappoint her." He turned and walked back into his house. leaving them standing on the sidewalk with the keys to two cars that were worth more than everything they had ever owned. Their first day at the hospital was a trial by fire. The place was a world away from the sterile, quiet showroom they were used to. It was a place of organized chaos, of bright colors and the constant hum of machines. It smelled of antiseptic and hope, and it was filled with children. Children with bald heads and tired eyes, but also children with infectious laughter and a resilience that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. They were met by a nurse named Sarah, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor and a warm, compassionate smile. She was the head of the pediatric oncology ward, and she had been briefed on their situation. "So you're the two hotshots who thought it was a good idea to mock a Medal of Honor recipient," she said, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't raise her voice, but her words were sharp as a scalpel. "Welcome to the real world." Chad opened his mouth to say something, but Sarah cut him off. "I don't care who you are or what you did. Here, you are not salesmen. You are not important. You are here to help. You will do what you're told when you're told. You will smile, you will be kind, and you will leave your egos at the door. These children are fighting for their lives. They don't have time for your nonsense. Am I clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Kevin mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. Chad just grunted. Their first task was to help with the lunch service. They pushed a cart from room to room, handing out trays of food that looked and smelled nothing like the gourmet meals they were used to. The children were a mix of ages, from toddlers to teenagers. Some were too sick to eat. Some were too sad. But many of them, despite their circumstances, managed a smile and a thank you. In one room, they met a little girl named Mia. She was 6 years old, with big brown eyes and a smile that could light up a room. She had a rare form of leukemia, and she had spent most of her short life in and out of hospitals. She had lost all her hair to chemotherapy, but she had a collection of colorful hats that she wore with a defiant sense of style. Today, she was wearing a bright yellow one with a big, floppy sunflower on it. When Chad entered the room with her tray, she looked up at him with an unfiltered, childish curiosity. "You're new," she said, her voice small but clear. "You look sad." Chad was taken aback. No one had ever accused him of looking sad before. Arrogant, smug, dismissive, yes. But sad? "I'm not sad," he said, a little too quickly. Mia just smiled. "It's okay to be sad. I'm sad sometimes too. But then I think about all the good things. Like ice cream, and puppies, and my mommy and daddy." She pointed a small, frail finger at his chest. "What are the good things you think about?" Chad didn't know what to say. He had never thought about it before. His life had been a relentless pursuit of what? Money? Status? The next big sale? He looked at this little girl, who was facing a battle he couldn't even comprehend, and he felt a profound sense of emptiness. Kevin, who had been standing in the doorway, watched the exchange with a lump in his throat. He saw the crack in Chad's armor, the first flicker of something human beneath the polished, cynical exterior. Later that day, they were tasked with cleaning the playroom. It was a bright, cheerful room filled with toys, books, and games. But it was also a room that had seen its share of tears and pain. As they wiped down the tables and sorted the toys, they found a small, framed drawing on the wall. It was a child's drawing of a family, a mom, a dad, and a little girl with long, brown hair. Underneath it was a name, Emily. Kevin felt a shiver run down his spine. He remembered Walter's words about his daughter. He looked at the drawing, at the simple, innocent depiction of a happy family, and he finally understood. He understood the depth of Walter's pain. He understood the meaning behind his grand, impossible gesture. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about teaching them a lesson. It was about love. A father's love for his daughter. A love so powerful it could turn a place of business into a beacon of hope. That evening, as they drove home in their new, expensive cars, they were silent. The city lights flashed by, a blur of color and noise. But for the first time, they weren't thinking about the next party, the next date, the next deal. They were thinking about Mia's smile, about Emily's drawing, about the quiet, unshakable dignity of an old man who had turned his grief into a gift. They were starting to understand that they had not been punished. They had been given a second chance. A chance to be better men. A chance to find their own good things to think about. The journey would be long and hard. But for the first time in their lives, they were on the right road. Meanwhile, Walter was sitting in the quiet of his study, the only light coming from a small desk lamp. The room was filled with books, maps, and mementos from a life of service and adventure. On the wall was a framed photo of a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. His wife, Eleanor, who had passed away 5 years after Emily. He was on the phone with Marcus Sterling. "The cars have been delivered," Walter said, his voice tired but steady. "The boys are at the hospital. The first step is done." "Walter, what you did yesterday. I'm still trying to process it," Sterling said, his voice filled with a genuine sense of awe. "It was the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen." "It was necessary," Walter said simply. "It was more than necessary. It was transformative." There was a pause on the line. "I want to help, Walter. Not just with the cars. With the hospital. The Emily Brewster Children's Hospital. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Walter was silent for a moment. He was a man who was used to doing things on his own. He had built his business from the ground up, relying on no one but himself. But this was different. This was not about business. This was about his daughter. And he knew he couldn't do it alone. "I'd like that, Marcus," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "I'd like that very much." "Good," Sterling said, his voice brisk and businesslike again, but with an undercurrent of warmth. "I have some friends in the construction business, the best in the country. And I know a few people on the board of the Medical Association. We can fast-track this. We can build your hospital, Walter. We can build a place that will be a testament to your daughter's spirit. A place of healing and hope that will stand for 100 years. As Walter listened to Sterling outline his plan, a sense of peace settled over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was not alone in his grief. He had an ally, a friend, someone who understood. He looked at the photo of his wife, and then at a smaller photo on his desk, a picture of a little girl with a bright, mischievous smile, a sunflower in her hair. "We're going to do it, Emily," he whispered. "We're going to build your magical hospital." And in the quiet of his study, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the promise of his future, Walter Brewster, the old soldier, the grieving father, the reluctant billionaire, felt a flicker of hope. The battle was far from over. But he had won the first skirmish, and he was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed settled into a routine, but it was a routine unlike any Chad and Kevin had ever known. Their mornings began not with sales meetings and commission reports, but with the quiet hum of the hospital waking up. They drove the sleek, luxury cars, no longer symbols of status, but chariots of hope, as Walter had called them. They transported children wrapped in blankets, their small bodies frail, but their spirits often surprisingly bright. They drove anxious parents who clutched worn teddy bears and whispered prayers. They ran errands, picking up groceries for families staying at the nearby Ronald McDonald House, fetching prescriptions, and sometimes just buying a specific brand of ice cream that a child craved after a grueling round of chemotherapy. Chad, the once arrogant salesman, found himself in a world where his sharp wit and cynical remarks were useless. The children didn't care about his expensive watch or his perfectly coiffed hair. They cared if he could tell a good knock-knock joke. They cared if he would play a game of Uno with them, even when he was tired. They cared if he remembered their names. He discovered, to his own astonishment, that he was a surprisingly good storyteller. He would sit by their bedsides and spin tales of adventure, of brave knights and magical kingdoms, his voice, once used to close deals, now weaving a spell of comfort and distraction. One afternoon, he was with Mia, the little girl with the sunflower hat. She was having a bad day. The chemo had left her weak and nauseous. She hadn't smiled once. Chad felt a knot of helplessness in his stomach. He had sold cars to celebrities and CEOs. He had navigated complex negotiations with ease, but he had no idea how to make a 6-year-old girl feel better. He remembered something Walter had told him about his daughter, Emily. She had loved to draw. On a hunch, he found a piece of paper and some crayons in the playroom. He sat down next to Mia's bed. "I'm going to draw you a picture," he said, his voice a little shaky. "It's going to be a terrible picture because I can't draw, but I'm going to try." He started to sketch, a clumsy, lopsided drawing of a sunflower field under a bright blue sky. Mia watched him, her big brown eyes curious. "That's a funny-looking sunflower," she said, her voice a little stronger. "I told you I was a terrible artist," Chad said with a shrug. "It looks more like a lumpy, yellow spider." A tiny giggle escaped Mia's lips. It was the first sound of happiness she had made all day. Encouraged, Chad kept drawing, making his sunflowers progressively more ridiculous. He drew one with sunglasses, another with a top hat. He drew a whole family of lumpy, yellow spiders having a picnic. Soon, Mia was laughing, a real, genuine laugh that filled the small room with a light that no amount of sickness could extinguish. Nurse Sarah, who had been passing by, stopped in the doorway and watched, a small, knowing smile on her face. She saw not a disgraced salesman, but a man discovering a part of himself he never knew existed. Kevin's transformation was quieter, more introspective. He was assigned to the teenage ward, a place of sullen silences and a quiet, simmering anger at the unfairness of it all. The teens were a tough crowd. They saw through his polite, professional demeanor in a second. They didn't want his pity. They didn't want his platitudes. He found his connection in an unexpected place, video games. In a small, crowded lounge, a group of boys were playing a racing game on a large screen. They were fiercely competitive, their trash talk a form of therapy. Kevin, a lifelong gamer, recognized the game. He picked up a controller. "You guys mind if I join?" he asked. The boys looked him up and down, their expression skeptical. "You play?" One of them, a lanky teenager named Leo with a sarcastic wit and a prosthetic leg, asked. "A little," Kevin said with a smile. He proceeded to beat them all, his thumbs a blur on the controller. The boys were stunned, then impressed. For the first time, they saw him not as an outsider, an adult from the world of the healthy, but as one of them. The controller became a bridge, a way to connect on their terms. They started talking, not about their sickness, but about games, about cars, about movies. Kevin listened. He learned about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for a future that was far from certain. He saw in them a courage that was different from the innocent resilience of the younger children. It was a grittier, more defiant courage. The courage to face their own mortality and still find a reason to laugh, to compete, to live. One evening, after a particularly intense gaming session, Leo turned to him. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "it's cool having you here. It's normal." The word hit Kevin with the force of a physical blow. Normal. It was the one thing these kids craved more than anything else. And he, in his small, insignificant way, was able to give them a piece of it. It was a feeling more satisfying than any commission he had ever earned. While Chad and Kevin were on their journey of self-discovery, Walter and Marcus Sterling were waging a different kind of war. They were a formidable team. Walter, with his quiet, unshakable resolve and his deep, personal understanding of the healthcare system's failings, provided the vision. Sterling, with his vast network of contacts and his ruthless business acumen, cleared the obstacles. They secured the land for the new hospital, a beautiful, sprawling piece of property on the edge of the city, surrounded by trees and open fields. They hired the best architects, a firm known for its innovative, child-friendly designs. The plans for the Emily Brewster Children's Hospital were unlike anything the medical world had ever seen. There would be no long, sterile corridors. Instead, the wards would be designed as neighborhoods, each with its own theme: a jungle, a space station, a fairy tale castle. There would be a rooftop garden, a movie theater, a swimming pool with a special lift for children in wheelchairs. It would be a place of healing, but also a place of joy. A place where children could be children, even in the midst of their toughest battles. But their grand vision was not without its challenges. They faced bureaucratic red tape, zoning issues, and the quiet, but powerful, opposition of a rival hospital corporation that saw their nonprofit, family-focused model as a threat to their bottom line. Walter, however, was undeterred. He had faced down enemy armies. He was not about to be intimidated by a group of corporate suits. He fought them with the same quiet, relentless determination he had used to build his business empire. He called in favors from old friends in high places. He used his own considerable wealth to grease the wheels of progress. And he never, ever lost sight of his goal. He was a frequent visitor to the pediatric ward, not as a benefactor, but as a friend. He would sit for hours with the children, reading them stories, helping them with their puzzles. He had a special bond with Mia. He saw in her the same spark, the same indomitable spirit that his Emily had possessed. One afternoon, he was sitting with her in the playroom. She was drawing a picture, her tongue stuck out in concentration. It was a picture of a big, beautiful building with a huge, smiling sun above it. That's my magical hospital, she said, pointing to the drawing with a crayon. The one you're going to build for Emily. Walter's heart ached. Yes, sweetheart, he said, his voice thick. That's the one. Is Emily going to be there? She asked, her big, innocent eyes looking up at him. Walter swallowed hard. She'll be there in spirit, he said. She'll be watching over all of you. She'll be the guardian angel of the hospital. Mia seemed to consider this for a moment. Then she smiled. Good, she said, because I'm going to need a guardian angel to help me get better so I can go home and get a puppy. Walter smiled back, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. In the simple, unwavering faith of this little girl, he found a renewed sense of strength. He was not just building a hospital. He was building a sanctuary, a fortress of hope against the darkness of despair. And he would let nothing and no one stand in his way. As the weeks turned into a month, the changes in Chad and Kevin were undeniable. They were no longer the shallow, self-absorbed young men who had walked into Prestige Motors. They were quieter, more thoughtful, more compassionate. They had seen things that had changed them forever. They had held the hand of a child who was scared. They had shared a laugh with a teenager who was in pain. They had witnessed the quiet, desperate courage of parents who would do anything, give anything, to save their children. On their last day of their mandatory volunteer service, Nurse Sarah called them into her office. She looked at them, her expression unreadable. Well, she said, you survived. Barely, Chad said with a small, self-deprecating smile. You did more than survive, Sarah said, her voice softening. You made a difference. The kids, they're going to miss you. A lump formed in Chad's throat. He thought of Mia, of her infectious giggle, of her ridiculous drawings. He was going to miss her too, more than he could have imagined. So what's next for you two? Sarah asked. Back to selling cars to rich people who don't need them? Chad and Kevin exchanged a look. They had been dreading this question. The thought of going back to their old lives, to the endless cycle of commissions and quotas, felt hollow, meaningless. I don't know, Kevin admitted, his voice honest. I can't go back to that. Not after this. Me neither, Chad said. Sarah smiled, a genuine, warm smile that transformed her face. I had a feeling you might say that. She pushed a piece of paper across her desk. It was an application form for the hospital's new transport program, a program that was being funded by a very generous, anonymous donor. It's a pay cut, she said. A big one. The hours are terrible, and some days it will break your heart. But I can guarantee you one thing. You will never have to wonder if your life has meaning again. Chad and Kevin looked at the application and then at each other. They didn't have to say a word. They both knew what they were going to do. They had found their good things. They had found their purpose. They were home. 2 years passed. 2 years of relentless work, of battles fought not on a battlefield with guns and mortars, but in boardrooms and zoning commission meetings. 2 years of concrete and steel rising from the earth, shaped by a father's grief and a community's hope. 2 years, and now, the day had come. The Emily Brewster Children's Hospital stood not as a building, but as a monument to a promise. It didn't scrape the sky in an arrogant display of modern architecture. Instead, it spread across the landscape, its wings of glass and warm, honey-colored stones seeming to embrace the rolling hills around it. It was designed to feel like a village, a collection of welcoming spaces rather than a sterile institution. Sunlight poured into every room. The walls were not a cold, clinical white, but were covered in vibrant murals painted by local artists. From the outside, it looked less like a hospital and more like a children's museum or a futuristic school, a place of discovery and wonder. Today was the grand opening, and the grounds were filled with a festive, buzzing energy. A large white tent had been erected on the great lawn, sheltering a crowd of hundreds from the warm afternoon sun. There were doctors in their crisp white coats, nurses in their colorful scrubs, city officials in their dark suits, and wealthy donors in their weekend finery. But mostly, there were families. Families who had known the fear and uncertainty of a child's illness, and who now looked upon this new building with a sense of overwhelming gratitude. Walter Brewster stood near the back of the crowd, away from the stage and the television cameras. He wore a simple, dark blue suit, but he looked as uncomfortable in it as he had in his old flannel shirt at the dealership. His eyes, those pale blue eyes that had seen so much, scanned the scene. He saw not a triumph of his own making, but the culmination of 1,000 small acts of courage and kindness. He saw his daughter's spirit, her boundless, optimistic love for the world, reflected in the hopeful faces of the children weaving through the crowd. He was an old man now, the lines on his face deeper than they had been 2 years ago. The project had taken its toll. But there was a new light in his eyes, a quiet peace that had been absent for so long. The wound of his grief was still there, a part of him forever, but it was no longer a gaping chasm of despair. It had been filled, piece by piece, with purpose. He saw Marcus Sterling on the stage, shaking hands and smiling for the cameras. Their partnership had grown into a deep and abiding friendship. Marcus had been his rock, his champion, the practical, worldly force that had helped him navigate the treacherous waters of philanthropy and construction. And then he saw them. Chad and Kevin. They were not in the crowd. They were working. Dressed in the hospital's official blue polo shirts, they moved with a quiet, confident efficiency, directing traffic, helping elderly guests, and coordinating the fleet of shiny, luxury cars, the original fleet from the dealership, that now served as the hospital's official transport service. They were transformed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a calm competence. The cynical smirks were gone, replaced by genuine, easy smiles. Chad, his hair no longer sculpted into a rigid helmet of gel, was kneeling down to speak to a small boy in a wheelchair, his face a picture of gentle concentration. Kevin was laughing with a group of teenagers, the same easy camaraderie he had discovered over a video game controller, now a natural part of who he was. They were no longer boys trying to sell an image of success. They were men who had found its true meaning. Walter felt a swell of pride. He had not set out to save them. He had only wanted to teach them a lesson. But in giving them a chance to serve, he had given them a chance to save themselves. The ceremony began. The mayor spoke. A famous singer performed a moving ballad. Marcus Sterling took the podium, his voice booming with pride as he thanked the donors, the architects, the doctors, and the staff. Finally, he introduced Walter. "There is one man," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a more personal, intimate tone, "without whom none of us would be here today. He is a man of quiet strength, of immense courage, and of a love so powerful it has literally moved mountains. He is a war hero, a business titan, but most importantly, he is a father. It is my profound honor to introduce the founder and visionary behind this magnificent hospital, my friend, Walter Brewster." A wave of applause swept through the crowd as Walter made his way to the stage. He moved slowly, deliberately, his posture still ramrod straight. He adjusted the microphone, his steady hands a stark contrast to the slight tremor of emotion in his jaw. He looked out at the sea of faces, and for a long moment, he was silent. "Thank you, Marcus," he began, his voice quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the tent. "Thank you all for being here. I am not a man who is comfortable with speeches. I am a soldier, a farmer's son, a truck driver. I believe in actions, not words." He paused, his gaze drifting to the hospital building behind him. 2 years ago," he continued, "I walked into a car dealership. I was an old man in a worn-out shirt, and I was treated as such. I was judged by my appearance. I was dismissed. I was mocked." A murmur went through the crowd. Many of them had heard the story, the legend of the old veteran who had bought an entire car dealership in an act of defiant pride. "But that story," Walter said, shaking his head slightly, "is not why we are here. That moment of disrespect was nothing. I have faced far worse in my life, as have many of you. No, we are here because of a little girl. A little girl with brown hair, a mischievous smile, and a heart bigger than this whole hospital. We are here because of my daughter, Emily." He pulled a worn photograph from his jacket pocket and held it up. The cameras zoomed in, and the image of a smiling, 7-year-old girl flashed on the large screens on either side of the stage. "Emily was a fighter," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "She fought a battle with a courage I have never seen on any battlefield. And she never complained. She never lost hope. In her darkest moments, she dreamed. She dreamed of a magical hospital, a place where children wouldn't be scared, a place with bright colors and gardens and happy doctors, a place where every child, regardless of their family's income, could get the best care in the world." He put the photograph back in his pocket, patting it gently. "I couldn't save my daughter. All the money in the world, all the power, all the medals, They were useless against the enemy that took her. And for a long time, I was lost. I was a man without a mission. But Emily, she gave me one last order. She gave me her dream. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes finding Chad and Kevin, who had stopped their work to listen, their faces etched with a profound, shared understanding. This hospital was not built with money, Walter declared, his voice rising with a quiet passion. It was built with love. It was built with the memories of a little girl's laughter. It was built with the dedication of doctors and nurses who work miracles every day. It was built with the support of a community that believes in taking care of its own. And, he added, a small, sad smile touching his lips, it was built with second chances. Two young men made a mistake that day in the dealership. They judged a book by its cover. But I am more proud of them today than I am of any business deal I have ever made. They have spent the last 2 years serving the children of this community with a dedication and a compassion that is an inspiration to us all. They learned that a man's worth is not measured by the car he drives, but by the service he gives. And in doing so, they have become an indispensable part of this hospital's heart and soul. Chad and Kevin looked down, their faces flushed, a mixture of humility and pride in their eyes. Walter turned his gaze back to the crowd, his voice now a soft, gentle whisper. Today, we open these doors. But this is not my hospital. It is Emily's hospital. It is your hospital. It is a sanctuary of hope, a fortress of love, and a promise that no child will fight alone, a promise that we will always, always choose compassion over cynicism, service over self-interest, and hope over despair. He stepped back from the podium, the applause thundering around him, a wave of emotion that he felt more than he heard. His mission was complete. He had kept his promise. Later, as the festivities wound down, a young reporter from the local news station approached Chad. She had been moved by Walter's speech and was looking for a human interest angle. That was an incredible tribute Mr. Brewster paid to you and your colleague, she said, her microphone held out. It must have been a difficult transition, giving up a successful career in sales to work for a hospital. Do you ever miss it? The commissions? The money? Chad looked over at the lawn, where a group of children were playing. Among them was Mia. She was 8 years old now, her hair grown back in soft, brown curls. She was in remission, her laughter a testament to the miracles that happened every day in the old hospital, and that would now have a new, brighter home. She saw Chad looking and waved, her smile as bright as the sunflower hat she still sometimes wore. Chad smiled back, a genuine, unforced smile that reached his eyes. He turned back to the reporter. You want to know about my commission? He said, his voice quiet. He reached into the back pocket of his trousers and pulled out a worn, slightly crumpled folder. He opened it. It was filled with children's drawings. Clumsy, colorful, beautiful drawings of cars, houses, families, and lumpy, yellow spiders. This is my payment, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. And I can tell you, without any hesitation, that I am the richest man I have ever known. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, Walter stood alone on a small hill overlooking the hospital. The lights were coming on, each window a small beacon of warmth and hope in the gathering dusk. The building seemed to breathe, alive with a purpose that was bigger than any one man. He heard footsteps on the grass behind him. It was Chad and Kevin. They came and stood beside him, not as employees, but as comrades. The three of them stood in a comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. It's beautiful, sir, Kevin said softly. She would have loved it, Chad added. Walter didn't reply. He just nodded, a lump in his throat. He took out his phone and looked at the picture on the lock screen. The smiling, 7-year-old girl with the mischievous eyes. He had done it. He had taken the ugliest, most painful event of his life and transformed it into something beautiful, something that would last, something that would heal. He had learned the soldier's final, most difficult lesson, that true strength is not in the power to destroy, but in the power to build, to love, to remember. Mission accomplished, Emily, he whispered to the photograph, his voice choked with tears he finally allowed to fall. Your magical hospital is open. Your chariots are ready, and your daddy will be home soon. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Chad. On his other side, Kevin stood, a quiet, reassuring presence. They were not just his employees. They were his legacy, 2. A legacy of redemption. Together, the three men, bound by an unlikely journey of loss and second chances, watched over the valley as the Emily Brewster Children's Hospital shone brightly in the night, a steadfast promise kept, a father's undying love made manifest in stone and light. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.